It was early October 2018 when I took a trip up to the old stone quarry in northern Vermont. I was 34 back then, single, working remote tech support, which meant I could do my job from anywhere as long as I had signal. I'd been burned out from the city, Boston specifically, and I wanted to get out and breathe for a while, just clear my head and spend some time alone in nature before the snow came. There was this listing on a strange little backwoods website I'd stumbled across during a late-night rabbit hole session. Some kind of niche site where property owners offered weird getaways. One in particular caught my attention. A small, ultra-modern glass cabin built right on the edge of an old abandoned quarry. The pictures showed something like a high-end art installation. A cube of thick, reinforced glass tucked between the rocks and birches, completely see-through except for a steel base and a solid roof. It was marketed as a minimalist dream. No curtains, no distractions, just you, nature, and the cold air. It was remote, about an hour outside a small town called Stafford Hollow. The property description was short, just a few lines, but the photos were strange. Too perfect. There were no shots of the road leading to the place. No photos taken from inside the cabin either. Just that weird, perfect cube in the middle of a clearing surrounded by forest and stone walls. Still, it was cheap. Really cheap. I figured some artist built it and then left it behind, and someone else had picked up the land and now rented it out. I booked it for 3 weeks. When I left Boston, the trees were just starting to go gold and red. I packed everything into my old Ford Escape. Sleeping bag, laptop, water jugs, food for at least 2 weeks, propane burner, and some tools in case anything broke. The guy who took my reservation had emailed me a set of coordinates and said there was a gravel pull-off where I'd leave my car, and from there it was a 15-minute walk into the woods along a faint path. I stopped in Stafford Hollow on the way in. It was a strange little town. Looked almost deserted, even though it had the typical stuff: one gas station, one diner, a small hardware store. People were quiet. Nobody said anything, but I got looks. Not mean looks, just cautious ones. I asked the guy at the gas station about the quarry. He just shrugged and said, "Still back there." I parked where the directions told me. There was no sign, no gate, just a strip of gravel off the side of an old dirt road. The forest was quiet. More quiet than I expected. I found the trail without too much trouble. It was faint, like the guy had said, but not hard to follow. Just worn grass and dirt where feet had been. 15 minutes later, I crested a little ridge, and there it was. The glass cabin looked exactly like the photos. It sat on a concrete slab, maybe a foot off the ground, about the size of a small bedroom. 10 feet by 10 feet, maybe a little bigger. Thick glass walls on all 4 sides, with a steel frame door on one end. Inside was a cot, a thin mattress, and a built-in bench made of concrete that ran along the wall. No kitchen, no bathroom, just a space. Stark, cold, and silent. Behind it, the quarry dropped off about 30 feet into a black pool of water. The edge was jagged but still stable, with old rusty ladders bolted into the rock face here and there. Must have been closed down decades ago. The place was beautiful in a brutal kind of way. I set up quickly. No one else around.
No Birdsson.
Just the wind through the dead leaves and the hum of distance. Cell signal was surprisingly strong, which was good, since I needed it for work. The first few days were peaceful. Cold mornings, long walks, making coffee on the propane burner. I'd sit outside on the bench and watch the sun move through the trees. Every night I slid into the cot and watched the stars through the ceiling. I was completely alone out there, but things started getting strange around the 4th night. I woke up just past 2 in the morning and felt watched. I know that's a cliche, but it's the only way to say it. I was in the middle of nowhere. No one should have been out there with me. Still, the hairs on my arms were up. I lay still and looked around. There were no walls to hide behind. Everything was glass. I could see the woods on all sides. I stared out, but everything was just black trees and moonlight. Then I saw him. He was standing about 20 feet away, off to the right of the cabin, half hidden behind a tree. Tall, wearing something dark, maybe a coat. I couldn't make out his face. He didn't move, just stood there perfectly still. My heart was pounding so hard I felt it in my throat. I didn't want to move, didn't want to show I'd seen him. I slid my hand slowly under the blanket to where I kept my pocket knife. It wasn't much, but it was all I had. I lay there for maybe 15 minutes. Eventually, when I blinked, he was gone. Just not there anymore. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I searched the area. No footprints. No signs anyone had been there. I thought maybe I dreamed it. I was out here alone. Maybe my brain was playing tricks. But the next night, he came back. This time, he was closer, right up against the tree line, still not moving, just watching. I sat up and turned on my headlamp and swept it across the woods. Nothing. When the light hit the trees, he was gone again. It went on like that for days. Every night, around the same time, I'd wake up and he'd be there. A little closer each time. Always still. Always silent. I started stacking stones near the edge of the cabin to mark where I thought he'd been. Each morning, I'd look out and the stones were undisturbed. No footprints. No tracks. Just forest and wind. I stopped sleeping. Every night was a waiting game. I started leaving the headlamp on all night, but it didn't matter. I'd blink and he'd be there. Blink again and he was gone. Always just outside the edges of the trees. Never moving. Never making a sound. One night, maybe 10 days in, I snapped. I grabbed the lamp, the knife, and ran out into the woods, yelling. I searched for over an hour, sweeping the light through every shadow. Nothing. I came back to the cabin exhausted, but something had changed. That night, I fell asleep hard. When I woke up, there was a small pile of stones stacked right outside the door. They weren't mine. They were smaller, smoother, deliberate, set in a neat little pyramid. My stomach dropped. That was the first time I knew for sure that it wasn't just in my head. Someone had been out there, watching, waiting. I decided I needed to leave, but when I tried to call for a ride, my phone wouldn't work. No signal. I walked back to the gravel lot where my car was, thinking I could just drive out, but my tires were slashed. All 4 of them. Deep, straight cuts like someone had used a razor. There was no help out here. No neighbors. No cameras. Just miles of forest and whatever this was. I started sleeping during the day and staying awake at night. I set up little traps, fishing line with bells, tripwire near the trees. But they never went off. Whoever he was careful. He wasn't trying to hurt me, just to be seen, just to show up. I began seeing things in the trees during the day too, shaped like people, shadows that didn't belong. Once I found a piece of rope tied to a branch in a noose shape, right near the edge of the quarry. It hadn't been there the day before. 2 days before the end of my reservation, I woke up to find the door to the cabin wide open. I know I locked it. I triple-checked every night. My bags had been moved, nothing taken, just shifted around. The cot had been turned slightly, like someone had sat on it. And that night, the man was standing right outside the glass, less than 2 feet from where I lay. Just standing there. No expression. Face pale, eyes dark. He didn't try to get in. Didn't touch the glass. Just stood there until morning. I didn't sleep. I didn't move. When the sun came up, he was gone. I packed everything. Left behind most of my gear. Just took what I needed and walked out, fast and quiet. I had to hike nearly 8 miles through the forest to reach another road. Eventually flagged down a truck. Didn't tell the guy much. Just that my car broke down and I needed help. He didn't ask questions. I came back later with a friend and a tow truck. The cabin was empty. The glass door hung open. The inside had been swept clean. The stones were gone. The little rope noose had been cut and taken down. I never went back. I reported it, of course. Gave everything to the police, photos, emails, the site I booked through. But the website had disappeared. Just gone. No record of the owner.
No listing.
They said they couldn't help. It was private land, and no real crime had happened. To this day, I don't know who he was. Maybe he lived out there watching that place. Maybe he was the owner. Maybe it wasn't about me at all. Maybe he just liked to be seen. To remind you that in a place like that, where there are no walls, no locks, and nowhere to hide, someone is always watching. That trip changed me. I don't camp anymore. I don't travel alone. I can't even sleep in rooms with uncovered windows. But I left with something important, too. A truth that sticks with me, no matter where I go. It's not the dark that's scary. It's what waits inside it, quiet, still, and patient, just behind the trees. I never imagined a place could be so still and quiet, yet make me feel so uneasy. I was 27 then, living alone in a small town in northern Vermont, a place surrounded by dense woods and rolling hills. It was the spring of 1999, a time when cell phones were rare and the internet was barely used. I had taken a week off from my job at the local factory to get away from the noise and stress of daily life. I wanted peace, solitude, and the kind of silence you could only find deep in the forest. That's how I ended up at a tiny cabin right next to an old graveyard. The cabin wasn't much, just a one-room wooden shack with a rusty tin roof, a small stone fireplace, and a creaky porch. The floorboards were worn, the windows were thick with grime, and the door didn't shut quite right. But the owner, an old man named Mr. Collins, had assured me it was sturdy enough. He'd inherited the cabin from his grandfather, who had built it in the early 1900s. It was nestled between towering pine trees, and just beyond the clearing lay the graveyard. The graveyard was small, no bigger than a backyard, fenced in by crooked iron bars that had rusted through in places. The headstones were old and cracked, some barely standing, their engravings weathered by time and moss. I arrived just before sunset, carrying a heavy backpack full of food, blankets, and some books. The air was cool and smelled like wet earth and pine needles. As I stepped off the dirt road and onto the cabin's porch, I noticed the graveyard's eerie quietness. No animals stirred, no wind whispered through the trees, only the distant call of a lone crow. The sky above was a dim shade of orange and pink, fading quickly to twilight. I pushed the door open, the hinges groaning, and stepped inside. Dust floated in the last rays of sunlight that came through the windows. I dropped my bag by the fireplace and lit a small kerosene lamp I had brought along. The cabin smelled of old wood and something else, a faint hint of dampness mixed with decayed leaves and soil. I got a fire going in the hearth and set my food on the small table. The fire crackled, and I could hear the occasional pop of resin in the pine logs. After a quick meal, I settled onto the rickety wooden chair with a book, but my eyes kept drifting outside, to the graveyard. Even in the fading light, the shapes of the headstones looked unnatural, almost like silent watchers. I tried to shake off the feeling and focused on the words in the book, but the silence in that place was heavy, like a thick blanket pressing down on me. Night came quickly. The moon was just a thin sliver in the dark sky, barely lighting the clearing. I closed the cabin door and locked it with the rusty latch. The creaking of the old cabin settled into a background noise as the fire burned low. I lay down on the narrow cot, wrapped in blankets, but sleep was hard to come by. Every small noise, the rustle of leaves, a snap of a twig, the distant hoot of an owl, felt magnified. I kept thinking about the graveyard just outside, how close it was, and the stories the old man had told me earlier. Mr. Collins had said the graveyard was from the 1800s, mostly family plots from early settlers. No one visited much anymore. The town had grown, and the newer cemetery was miles away. The old graveyard was forgotten, left to the elements and the forest reclaiming it slowly. As the hours passed, I began to notice something else. Faint sounds that didn't fit the night's usual noises. It started as soft shuffling, almost like footsteps, but slow and careful. I told myself it must be animals, raccoons, foxes, or even a deer moving through the underbrush. But the sounds were too deliberate, too close. Sometimes it sounded like something scraping against the iron fence, slow and steady. I sat up and stared out the window. The graveyard was dark and shadowy, but in the moonlight, I could make out a figure standing just beyond the fence. It was tall, but hunched slightly, wearing something dark that blended into the shadows. The figure didn't move much, just stood there watching the cabin. My heart raced, but I told myself it was probably just a person passing through or a hunter checking traps in the woods. I decided not to look again and lay back down, though sleep was impossible. Every creak of the cabin made me jump. I kept hearing the scraping sounds by the fence, faint footsteps circling the graveyard. At one point, I got up and grabbed a flashlight from my bag. I opened the door quietly and shone the light outside. The beam cut through the dark, illuminating the tombstones and the fence. No one was there. The air was cold and damp, and the ground underfoot was soft from recent rain. I looked around carefully but found no footprints or signs of anyone, just the marks of animals in the dirt and leaves. I closed the door and locked it again, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I stayed up the rest of the night, sitting by the dying fire, staring out the window. The next day, I tried to shake off the nerves. I told myself that being alone in a strange place made me imagine things. I packed a small bag and decided to take a walk around the graveyard during daylight. I wanted to understand the place better, maybe find a way to feel less uneasy. The sun was bright and warm, shining through the tree branches and making the moss on the stones glow green. The graveyard was peaceful in the light, almost beautiful in its own way. I walked slowly, reading the inscriptions on the headstones. Many were faded beyond recognition, but some names and dates were clear. Families who had lived and died here long ago. Some stones were toppled or broken, half swallowed by roots. As I moved around, I noticed something strange. On one side of the graveyard, near a large oak tree, the earth looked disturbed. The ground was freshly turned, like someone had dug there recently. I knelt down and examined the soil. It was loose and soft, with clumps of dark earth piled on the side. I glanced around but saw no tools or signs of a grave. My heart began to beat faster. Why would someone dig here? The graveyard was supposed to be abandoned. I scanned the tree line and saw nothing, but the feeling of being watched returned. I stood up quickly and walked back to the cabin, the hairs on my neck standing on end. Once inside, I checked the locks and windows. I found nothing unusual but couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been close. Maybe even inside the clearing last night or the day before. That afternoon, I heard a car on the dirt road leading to the cabin. It was rare for anyone to come here. I peeked out and saw an older woman driving an old pickup truck, dusty and worn. She parked near the graveyard and got out, carrying a bag of tools and some flowers. She didn't see me watching. She walked slowly to a particular grave and began cleaning the stone and placing the flowers. She worked carefully, like someone who had done this many times before. I felt relief, seeing a familiar face, even if a stranger. I wanted to ask who she was and why she cared about this forgotten graveyard, but I stayed inside, unsure if I should approach. The woman worked for nearly an hour before getting back into her truck and driving away. I watched the dust trail disappear down the road and then closed the curtains. That evening, I felt calmer, knowing someone else cared for the place. But my uneasy nights didn't stop. The strange noises, the footsteps, and scraping at the fence returned. The cabin seemed to creak and sigh in the wind, though there was barely any breeze. One night, while sitting by the fire, I heard the scraping again, louder this time. I grabbed a flashlight and opened the door. The beam of light landed on the fence, where I saw fresh scratch marks, long and deep. My stomach twisted. Someone had been here recently, close enough to reach the fence with their hands. Then, from the edge of the clearing, I spotted the figure again. Not moving, just watching, almost blending into the shadows. I froze. The figure looked human but strange, the way it stood, the slow, cautious movements. I felt trapped, like a deer in the headlights. I closed the door quickly, bolting it with the rusty latch. My mind raced. Who was this person? What did they want? The next morning, I found the front porch had footprints. Heavy boots, muddy and worn. They circled around the cabin, then stopped near the back door. I gathered all my courage and decided to leave that day. I packed quickly, ignoring the peaceful morning sun. I wanted nothing more than to get away from that cabin, the graveyard, and the watching figure. As I loaded my bag into my old pickup, I looked back one last time. The graveyard was calm in the morning light, but I knew the quiet was deceptive. Driving away, I promised myself I would never return. Weeks later, back home in town, I thought about that trip. I told myself the figure was probably a homeless man or someone who lived in the woods. Maybe they were searching for something or just watching. No ghosts, no spirits, just a person with unknown intentions. That experience stayed with me. The cold feeling of being watched, the fresh earth in the graveyard, the scratches on the fence, and the footprints circling my cabin. I never found out who that watcher was or what they wanted, but I knew one thing for sure. Some places, even in daylight, hold secrets best left alone. It was late autumn of 1993, and I had been a park ranger for nearly 8 years at Pine Ridge National Forest, a vast, quiet stretch of wilderness in northern Oregon. At 32 years old, this was the kind of work I loved. Long days in the woods, the smell of damp earth and pine needles, the solitude broken only by the call of birds or the rustle of small animals. Most of the time, the forest was peaceful, sometimes even beautiful. But that year, something about the place felt different. Thicker, heavier, like the forest itself was holding its breath. The park's main ranger station was a solid, weathered log cabin tucked in a clearing near the edge of the forest road, but I was assigned to the remote backcountry cabin, known simply as Cabin 7. It sat alone, deep in the woods, miles from the main road and the nearest visitor trails. The cabin was built decades earlier as a fire watch post. It wasn't fancy, just a single room with a wood stove, a bunk bed, a small desk, and a collection of old maps and radios that mostly didn't work. Water came from a nearby stream, and the only electricity was a small solar panel that powered a single dim light bulb. I was there for a 2-week solo shift, checking for illegal hunting, monitoring wildlife, and making sure no one wandered into dangerous areas during the early fire season. It was early October, the air was sharp and cold at night, and the days were already growing shorter. On my first day, the hike from the trailhead to the cabin took nearly 3 hours. The forest was quiet except for the crunch of my boots on the dry leaves and the occasional creak of ancient trees swaying in the wind. I carried a pack with enough supplies for 2 weeks: food, first aid, emergency gear, and my standard ranger equipment. My radio had a weak signal at best, so I knew I'd be mostly on my own. The cabin itself was exactly what I expected. Rough but solid. The log walls were darkened by decades of smoke from the wood stove. The window panes were thick, some cracked, but they let in enough light during the day. I unpacked slowly, arranged my gear neatly, stacked firewood by the stove, and checked the maps for my patrol routes. There was no cell signal here, no electricity beyond that single light bulb.
No neighbors, no distractions.
I spent the first few days following the trails, checking for signs of illegal activity. The forest was empty except for the usual animals. Deer tracks, squirrel nests, the occasional fresh bear prints. I kept a journal each evening by the fire, recording what I saw, the weather, and any oddities. But the oddities started small. A snapped branch here, a half-burned campfire pit where no campers should have been, a strange scrape on a tree that didn't look like any animal claw mark I knew. At first, I thought maybe hunters had passed through. Illegal hunting was always a problem, but the deeper I got into the forest, the less likely it seemed. The campfire pit was too fresh and clean, no ashes, just a circle of scorched earth with some sticks arranged oddly. The scrape on the tree was too high for a bear or deer to make, almost human but not quite. By the 5th day, the feeling of being watched settled over me. Couldn't shake it. Every time I looked up from my patrol, I thought I saw movement just at the edge of the trees. Sometimes I heard soft snaps of branches breaking off behind me when no one should have been there. I carried my rifle, but I wasn't eager to use it. I knew most of the forest sounds, and these didn't fit anything I knew. The nights were worse. The cabin was small, and the forest pressed in tight around it. The wind sometimes rattled the windows and made the trees groan. I kept the stove fire burning low for warmth and comfort, but each creak and pop of the wood felt louder in the dark. One night, I thought I heard footsteps crunching on the dry leaves outside, slow and deliberate. I grabbed my flashlight and peered out, but all I saw was the black shape of the trees swaying in the wind. Sleep was hard to come by. I would lie awake in the bunk, heart pounding, listening to the quiet forest sounds that didn't quite feel right. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. Too much solitude, too much silence. On the 7th day, I found something that shook me more than anything. I was following an old logging trail I hadn't checked yet when I saw it. A crude symbol carved into the bark of a tall pine tree. It was a circle with jagged lines cutting through it, deeply gouged into the wood. I ran my fingers over the rough edges. It wasn't natural. Someone had been here marking the forest. Nearby, the ground was disturbed. Soft dirt dug up, footprints pressed into the mud. They were too large for any animal and oddly shaped, like a mix between a boot and bear skin. I took pictures and measured the prints. They led off into the thickest part of the forest, where no trail went. I debated whether to follow them. My training told me not to go off established paths alone, but curiosity gnawed at me. I decided to circle back to the cabin, get some rest, and report the find during my next check-in. That night, I barely slept. I sat by the stove, cleaning my rifle, glancing out the window every few minutes. The forest was pitch black beyond the weak circle of light cast by my flashlight. Around midnight, the power from the solar panel flickered and died, plunging the cabin into darkness except for the fire. Suddenly, I heard it, a low, deliberate tapping on the cabin wall. Soft, rhythmic, and very close. My heart jumped. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it outside. Nothing, no movement. Just the trees, still and silent. The tapping stopped. I sat frozen, my rifle across my lap. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows again. I told myself it was a branch hitting the wall, but it didn't feel right. Over the next few days, the signs of someone or something being nearby increased. I found scraps of torn cloth hanging from bushes, dark green, like a military jacket. Footprints circled the cabin at night, fresh and muddy. At one point, I found a bundle of sticks arranged near the creek, almost like a crude trap. I reported the situation during my week radio check-ins. The response was always the same: no known hunters or poachers reported in your area. Stay safe and report if situation worsens. By the 10th day, the tension inside the cabin was almost unbearable. Every noise, every shadow felt like a threat. I double-checked my supplies, packed my emergency kit, and prepared for an early departure. That night, something broke the quiet. I was awakened by a loud crash outside, like a heavy tree limb breaking. The cabin shook slightly. My fire was nearly out, the room dim. I grabbed my rifle and moved to the door, heart hammering. Outside, the moon was hidden by thick clouds. I aimed my flashlight through the window and swept the clearing. For a moment, I saw movement. A dark figure, crouched just beyond the tree line, watching me. I held my breath. The figure didn't move for long, then vanished into the forest like a shadow dissolving in the dark. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. At first light, I packed everything quickly, loaded my gear into the backpack, and started the hike back to the main station. Every step felt heavy, like the forest was pressing down on me, trying to keep me there. When I finally reached the ranger station 2 days later, I reported everything in detail. The photos of the footprints and the carved symbol were sent to the park police. A search team was sent in to investigate. Weeks later, the official report came back. No signs of poachers or hunters. The prints matched no known animals or people. The carved symbol was dismissed as graffiti, but none of the staff recognized it. The strange things I saw and heard were chalked up to the natural sounds of the forest, amplified by my imagination. But I knew better. I left the Park Service soon after. The woods didn't feel safe anymore, not because of wild animals or weather or accidents. It was something else, something human, something silent and watching. Years later, I still dream of that cabin, the tapping on the walls, the figure in the dark. The forest may be quiet on the surface, but beneath it, the shadows move and sometimes they watch. My name is Alex Ward. I was 39 the year I rented the cabin near the old slate quarry in northern Vermont. It was the fall of 2016. I remember it clearly because I'd just gotten out of a long relationship and I needed to clear my head. I didn't want to be around anyone. No phones ringing, no emails, no city noise. I looked up remote rentals and came across this small listing on a local forum. No official websites, just a picture of a one-story wooden cabin backed against a hill, surrounded by thick forest, and one line underneath, asterisk, available from October through November. No neighbors. For miles off route. Inquire by mail only. Asterisk, I sent the letter, got a handwritten one back 2 weeks later. A man named Curtis said it was available for the 2 months I wanted and that he'd leave the key under a stone frog by the front steps. Payment was by money order, half up front, the rest when I left. I liked how low-tech it all was. It felt like I was already halfway disconnected just by arranging it. When I got there, the gravel road leading to the cabin was so rough and narrow that I had to park my truck a mile and a half out and hike the rest with my backpack and a few supplies. There were orange and red leaves everywhere. The trees were tall and close together. The path twisted up and down the hilly ground, muddy in places, silent but for the crunching under my boots. I remember passing a rusted-out truck in the brush off to the right, the tires long gone, windows broken out, just sitting there, half swallowed by ferns and moss. It looked like it had been there for years. I didn't think much of it at the time. The cabin was just like the photo, squat, grayish-brown, with one small chimney and green-trimmed windows. The front steps had no railing, just 4 wooden planks up to the door. Sure enough, there was a stone frog next to them, and under it, a key tied with faded red twine. The inside smelled of dry wood and old earth, but it was clean. A table and 2 chairs, a small couch, a twin bed pushed against the wall, and a narrow kitchenette with a pump sink. No electricity, no running water, just a little wood stove, a kerosene lantern, and a note on the table from Curtis reminding me to refill the rain barrel every couple of days or it'd freeze. There was no cell service out there, no towers, no sounds but wind, sometimes birds. On the first night, I couldn't sleep. Not because I was scared, just too used to noise. The silence was thick. I kept listening to it like I was waiting for something to break it, but nothing did. I stayed up late just staring out the window, watching the trees sway in the wind. The days settled into a rhythm. I'd wake with the sun, make coffee over the propane stove, walk the forest trails, write in my notebook. I started chopping wood for the stove, dragging branches from the surrounding trees, splitting logs with the old axe Curtis had left. Sometimes I'd hike down to the quarry about a mile north of the cabin. It was filled with dark water, deeper than I could see. The cliffs were steep and silent. The place felt heavy, like sound didn't carry well there. Once I tossed a big stone into the water just to hear it splash, but I never heard it hit. That was the first time I got a strange feeling in my gut. One afternoon, maybe 2 weeks in, I saw a man in the woods. I was carrying firewood back to the cabin, about a quarter mile out, following a faint deer trail. The sun was behind the trees, casting long shadows across the underbrush. And there he was, standing still, maybe 30 yards to my left. I could only see his silhouette at first, tall, lean, wearing a dark coat. At first, I thought it was Curtis checking in. But when I turned toward him, he didn't move, just kept standing there, half concealed by a tree. I lifted a hand, more out of instinct than greeting. He didn't respond. I looked away for a second to shift the wood in my arms, and when I looked back, he was gone. No sound, no movement, just trees. I tried to tell myself I imagined it. Maybe a tree trunk or shadow looked like a person for a second. It's easy to get turned around out there. But the next morning, I found footprints near the rain barrel. Not boot prints, sneaker treads, fresh in the mud. They came from the woods and circled the cabin twice before heading off toward the quarry. I followed them for maybe 10 minutes before they disappeared into dry leaves. That's when I started locking the door at night, even though the place felt too remote to bother before. I kept the axe inside instead of the shed. I started sleeping with my flashlight within reach. Still, I wasn't scared. Not yet, just cautious. One night, I heard movement outside. Not animals, slow, deliberate footsteps on the leaves. I killed the lantern and stood in the dark, waiting. They circled the cabin again, just like before. I pressed my ear to the wall, heart hammering. Whoever it was didn't knock, didn't try the door, just paced. After a while, they walked off toward the woods again. I didn't sleep at all that night. I debated hiking out and sleeping in my truck, but it was a long walk in the dark. I told myself maybe it was just a hunter, maybe someone local using the woods and didn't mean any harm. Still, I started keeping track of anything unusual. Scratches on the cabin doorframe, a torn corner on the window screen, a dent in the metal bucket I used for collecting water. Little things that could have been animals, but they didn't feel random. About 5 days later, I was walking near the quarry again and noticed something I'd missed before. A path leading off the far edge. It wasn't a full trail, just the ground worn down, enough to follow. I figured maybe it was just an old work road. Curiosity got the better of me and I followed it. It led downhill for maybe half a mile, twisting between mossy rocks and pine trees. Then I saw a small structure, a shed maybe, or what was left of one. The roof had collapsed in the middle. The walls were patchy and rotting. I stepped inside and saw rusted tools, a broken cot, and piles of torn fabric in the corner. Smelled like mold and something else sharp like ammonia. There were old food wrappers, empty cans stacked in the corner, rat droppings everywhere. But what stopped me cold was a rope tied from the rafters down to a tree branch just outside. Not a noose, but a pulley system, like someone had rigged something to haul weight up and down. And behind the shed, I found a shallow pit. It wasn't deep, but it was wide and full of old garbage. Metal scraps, bones. Some looked like deer, but I swear some didn't. I didn't touch anything, just turned and walked fast back to the cabin, watching the trees behind me the whole time. That night, I pushed the table in front of the door, slept with the axe next to me. No footsteps came, but I woke around 3 a.m. to see light flickering through the cracks in the wall. Firelight. When I peeked through the window, I saw a flame in the woods, maybe 100 yards out. Someone had lit a small campfire and was sitting beside it, alone. I couldn't see his face, just the shape of him. Long arms, legs stretched toward the fire, like he wasn't in any rush, like he knew I was watching. I didn't move until dawn. When the light came up, the fire was gone. So was he. I hiked out that morning with my pack and left a note for Curtis with the rest of the money in an envelope on the table. I didn't lock the door, just walked out the same way I came in. When I got to the truck, I found a dead rabbit on the hood. Its neck was broken clean, laid out neatly like it was meant to be found. No blood, just stiff in the cold. I didn't touch it, just drove. I stayed at a cheap motel in Montpelier that night. The next day, I reported everything to the county sheriff. They took it down, said they'd send someone to check it out. That was it. I never heard back. A few weeks later, I mailed Curtis again, just to ask if he'd gone up to the cabin lately. The letter came back marked return to sender. No such address, no such person. I looked up the original forum post. Gone. Nothing archived. No trace of the listing. I even drove back up the highway the following year just to find the trail. Couldn't. It was like it had grown over. I don't know who was out there. I don't know if they lived there or just watched the cabin for fun. I don't even know if Curtis was a real person. Maybe the cabin was never meant to be rented. Maybe it was bait. What I do know is this. Someone had been out there long before me, and someone stayed long after. I haven't gone back to the woods since. I still camp, but only in open parks. I still hike, but only near towns. And I always check the door locks twice before bed. And when it's quiet at night, too quiet, I remember the sound of those footsteps circling. Not rushing, just waiting. It was the fall of 2016 when I decided to buy a small piece of land deep in the Arkansas woods, about 40 minutes north of Russellville. I was 34, recently divorced, and tired of everything that felt artificial. I wanted a place where the air didn't smell like city fumes and I didn't have to make small talk with people I didn't like. I found a cheap patch of land online, just under 4 acres. Mostly pine trees with an old hunting trail leading in from a gravel service road. The listing was vague, but the photos looked clean. There was even a spot already cleared out by the previous owner. I paid cash for it. It was all I had left after selling my half of the house. I didn't have big plans. I wasn't trying to build a fancy off-grid home with solar panels or composting toilets. All I wanted was a small, one-room cabin. Just a dry space where I could sleep, cook, maybe hang some tools on the wall. I'd already drawn up a layout on grid paper. 16 by 12, a sloped tin roof, 1 window. Nothing fancy. I'd even found an old wood-burning stove on Craigslist from a guy down near Hot Springs. I borrowed a friend's trailer and picked it up the week before. It was early October when I loaded up my truck with everything I thought I needed. Framing lumber, nails, hand tools, food, a tarp, and 2 large totes full of gear. The plan was simple. Take 3 days off from my part-time job at a landscaping company and build the structure frame to finish. I didn't think much about the weather. Forecast said scattered rain, but I figured I could work around it. I arrived late in the afternoon. The sun was already dipping low and the sky was a flat gray, not moving much. I parked my truck along the trailhead and walked down the clearing to where the land opened up. The previous owner had done a good job leveling the spot. All I had to do was mark my corners and dig in. I unloaded the gear and pitched a tarp between two trees where I could crash for the night. I didn't bother with a tent. The first night it started to rain. Not a thunderstorm, just a steady, cold drizzle that never let up. It soaked the top of my tarp and filled the corners like a stretched out bowl. I hardly slept. Something about the weight of the water, the sounds of the woods, the occasional crack of a branch out in the trees. It all kept me on edge. And when morning came, I realized I had underestimated everything. The clearing was muddy. The rain had softened the dirt enough that walking around felt like trudging through thick cake batter. Every footstep made a sucking sound. I didn't have proper boots, just worn hiking shoes. By the time I set my string lines and started measuring out the base frame, my feet were already cold and soaked. But I kept going. I had to. I told myself this was my fresh start. I didn't care about being comfortable. I cared about finishing. I worked until my hands were stiff from gripping the hammer. I used concrete blocks as my foundation. Cheap, fast, and easy to adjust. I dug them down and leveled each one by eye. Then I laid out the floor joists, squared the corners, and screwed down the subfloor. It was slow going, but by dusk I had something that looked like a rough platform. That night, the rain picked up. I remember sitting on an overturned bucket under the tarp, eating from a cold can of beans with my headlamp flickering. The wind was cutting through the trees harder now, and I could hear the rain smacking off everything around me. Leaves, tarp, ground. I don't know why, but I started to feel watched. I'd barely seen a squirrel all day, and that made it worse. There wasn't even bird noise, just wind and water. And somewhere off to the north, I swore I heard something move. Not a branch falling, something heavier, like a person stepping into the brush. I told myself it was a deer, maybe a hog, but it didn't sit right. I stayed up way too late, light still on, my folding knife tucked into the side pocket of my jeans. When I woke up the next morning, my tarp had sagged so low from the rain that it was practically sitting on top of me. My gear was soaked. One of the plastic totes had tipped, and the corner was full of water. I had to dump half my supplies and start over. My hands were shaking, not from fear, but from cold and wet and lack of sleep. Still, I worked. I stood the walls, used temporary braces to keep them upright, then nailed in the top plates. The rain never stopped. By the end of the second day, I had all 4 walls up, and I started working on the roof joists. My hands were so raw I could see cracks under the nails. The hammer slipped twice. Once I almost fell from the ladder, but I kept telling myself, finish the shell, seal it in, and then you can dry off. It was that second night when things got worse. I just crawled back under the tarp and changed into the driest clothes I could find. I was sitting with my knees pulled up, trying to warm myself with a cheap camp stove, when I heard it again. Movement. This time it was closer. Definitely footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. I turned off the stove and waited. Rain was still tapping the plastic above me, but I swear I could hear the footsteps coming closer from the tree line. I clicked off my headlamp and listened. Nothing. Then, a soft splash, like someone stepping into a puddle just past the tarp's edge. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I just sat there, eyes wide, heart thumping in my ears. I waited like that for what felt like 10 minutes, maybe longer. Then, all at once, a sharp cracking sound from the woods to the west. Something had broken. Not a branch falling, something getting stepped on. Hard. I grabbed my flashlight and jumped up, but when I swung the beam into the trees, there was nothing. Just wet trunks and scattered fog. I stood out there for a long time, turning the light back and forth, but saw nothing move. The next morning, I found boot prints. They were faint, but they were there, in the soft mud near the back wall of my cabin. Not my prints. These were bigger, wider. Someone else had been there. I checked the edges of my gear. Nothing taken, but my bucket had been moved. I was sure of it. I always left it under the ladder, and now it was sitting at the edge of the platform. That day, I rushed everything. I nailed up the roof panels without finishing the gable cuts. I stapled the tar paper while the wind ripped at it. I didn't eat. I didn't sit down. I just worked until I could close the cabin off. When I finally hung the door, just a sheet of plywood with hinges, I felt some small relief. I locked it from the inside with a hasp I had picked up at the hardware store. Then I sat down on the floor and just stared at the wall for a while. It was the first time in 2 nights that I didn't feel rain hitting me, but I didn't feel safe. That last night was the worst. Started around midnight. A heavy knocking sound woke me. Not the wind, not branches knocking. Slow, deliberate, came from the back wall. 3 knocks, then silence, then 3 more. I stayed still. I didn't move. I had no windows, just solid walls and 1 door. I couldn't see anything outside, but I knew someone was out there. I didn't yell. I didn't shine my light. I just waited. Then came the sound of something dragging, like fabric or canvas being pulled across the roof. I held my breath. The dragging moved from one corner to the other, then stopped. Rain kept falling, but I could hear footsteps again, this time moving toward the front door, and then nothing. I sat there with my knife in my hand until dawn. When morning came, I stepped outside. I checked every inch of the ground around the cabin. The prints were there again. Same shape, deep, wide. They led from the back wall around to the door, then vanished into the trees. I didn't pack my things. I didn't finish the trim. I didn't install the window. I just threw my gear into the bed of the truck and drove away. I didn't stop until I hit the gas station on the highway, and even then, I didn't talk to anyone. I just sat there in the lot, shaking, staring at the trees. I didn't go back to that cabin for 6 months. When I finally did, in spring, I brought a friend. We brought rifles. I didn't tell him everything, just that I thought someone had been messing around on the land. When we arrived, the cabin was still standing. Roof held. Door was locked. But something had been dragged around the front. The dirt was cleared in a perfect arc, like someone had pulled a chain or heavy rope. We didn't stay long. Now, years later, I've sold the land, lost money on it. I live in a small place on the edge of town, with neighbors I don't talk to and a fenced-in yard. I still build things, tables, chairs, shelves, but I haven't gone back into the woods. I don't camp anymore. I don't hike alone. And every time it rains at night, I lie awake and listen, because somewhere out there, in the silence of the trees, someone was watching me build that cabin, and they never wanted me to finish. I was 35 when I made one of the worst decisions of my life. It was the fall of 2019, late October, and I had taken a break from my job as a heavy machinery mechanic in Nebraska. I needed to clear my head, and my plan was simple: spend a week off the grid in the wilderness of northern Utah. I had an old acquaintance, Mike, who owned a small wooden cabin out there. Nothing fancy, just a single story. No electricity, no plumbing, surrounded by forest, about an hour's hike from the nearest gravel road. Mike and I hadn't talked in years, but I remembered him saying once, "If you ever need to get away from it all, just go up there. You've got the key." And I still had the key he mailed me one Christmas when we were closer. I figured it was better than a hotel or campsite. I packed my gear: sleeping bag, propane stove, tools, warm clothes, canned food, water jugs, a few books, and my rifle. I told my brother I'd be unreachable for a while and took off in my truck early on a Sunday. The gravel road that led close to the cabin was half overgrown and barely passable. I parked where it ended, strapped on my backpack, and hiked the last couple of miles. The trail was narrow and covered in dry leaves. It was colder than I expected, and I kept my gloves on the whole way. The cabin looked just like I remembered from the one time I visited Mike there back in 2012. Gray wood, tin roof, one window on each side, front porch with 2 chairs, firewood stacked beside the door. It sat in a small clearing with nothing but pines and aspen all around. No phone signal, no sounds except wind and birds. Inside, it was a single room with a wood stove, an old bed frame, a tiny table, and a shelf with some canned goods and matches. The floor creaked under my boots. I unpacked, got a small fire going in the stove, and spent that first night reading by lantern light, wrapped in a thick wool blanket. The first 3 days were uneventful, which was exactly what I wanted. I spent most of my time chopping wood, hiking short distances, or sitting on the porch staring at the trees. I didn't see anyone, and I wasn't expecting to. I heard coyotes at night and saw deer tracks near the stream about half a mile down a hill. A couple of mornings, I found raccoon prints near the firewood stack. That's all normal. That's what I came out for, to feel like I was out in the world again, where nothing man-made mattered. But the 4th day is when things changed. That morning, I woke up to find the firewood pile knocked over. At first, I figured an animal did it, but it wasn't just scattered, it was spread out in a line, like someone had dragged pieces toward the tree line. A few logs were stacked in a pattern like a triangle. That didn't feel natural. I walked a wide circle around the clearing but didn't find any other signs. No tracks, no droppings, no claw marks. I res-tacked the wood and told myself I was overthinking it. That evening, I went to bed early after a long hike around a ridgeline to the east. I locked the door with the old bolt and set my rifle against the bed. Around 2 or 3 a.m., I woke up to a sound outside. Not an animal sound, more like footsteps. Slow, crunching footsteps on dry leaves. I held my breath and waited. The steps stopped. I didn't hear anything else for a few minutes. Then came a sharp tap on the wall right near the window. Just one. I sat there in the dark, heart pounding, holding the rifle close. I didn't want to use it. I didn't want to go outside. I waited for maybe an hour before I fell asleep again. The next morning, I checked around the cabin. No tracks, no damage, but on the window ledge right outside where I heard the tap, there was a small pile of rocks, perfectly stacked. 5 rocks, balanced in a little tower. Now, I've spent plenty of time in the woods. I've dealt with squatters, hunters, even nut jobs trying to mess with people. But this didn't feel like that. This felt off. No sign of someone camping nearby, no tire tracks, no cigarette butts or trash. Just these weird things happening quietly at night. I thought about leaving then, but I told myself I was just spooking myself. It was probably some weird prank or a hiker messing around. Still, I brought the rifle with me the next time I walked down to the stream. I didn't enjoy the hike that day. I kept looking over my shoulder, and I started noticing things I hadn't before, like how quiet the woods were.
No birds, no rustling.
Just wind through the trees, too smooth, too steady. The air smelled strange too. Not rotting, not smoky, just wrong. Like damp soil mixed with something metallic. Couldn't place it. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept the lantern on and stayed dressed with my boots on. Just before dawn, I heard something again, but this time it was louder. A dragging sound across the porch, like something pulling a heavy sack or scraping claws along the wood. Then a knock. Not on the wall this time, on the door. One knock, then silence. I didn't move. I sat there, breathing as quietly as I could, and waited until the sun came up. When I opened the door, there was nothing there. But about 20 feet from the cabin, near the edge of the clearing, I saw it. A deer carcass, but it wasn't fresh. It looked like it had been dead for days, bloated, stiff. Its head was twisted fully backward, and one leg was torn off and missing. Worse, there were cuts along its sides. Not claw marks, cuts. Long, straight slices like they were made with a knife. Clean. I went back inside and didn't come out for hours. I didn't even eat that day. I just sat at the table, holding the rifle and watching the trees through the window. That evening, I finally got myself moving. I packed everything. I was leaving. It didn't matter if it was 5 p.m. and I had to hike out in the dark. I was done. I strapped my gear to my back, filled a thermos with hot water, and stepped onto the porch. That's when I saw someone, or something. It was standing about 30 yards away, half behind a tree. I could see part of it, an arm, part of a shoulder. First, I thought it was a man, but it wasn't moving right. The arm was too long. The skin was grayish, not like clothes, but bare skin stretched too tight. And it was breathing, not fast, but deep, loud enough that I could hear it over the wind. I raised my rifle. It moved behind the tree, slow and deliberate, and then nothing. I didn't go after it. I didn't move. I stood there on the porch, aiming at nothing, not blinking, not breathing. After a few minutes, I backed into the cabin and bolted the door. I stayed up all night, didn't sleep, didn't make a sound. Every now and then, I'd hear crunching leaves, sometimes far off, sometimes close. But it never came back to the porch. At first light, I left everything except the rifle and my water. I ran. I didn't care how much I left behind. I hiked the 2 miles back to my truck in under an hour. I kept looking behind me. I never saw anything, but I felt it. I felt like something was following me the whole time. When I got to the truck, I didn't even check the tires or the undercarriage. I just started it and floored it back toward the main road. I didn't stop until I got to a gas station with lights and people. It's been years since then, and I haven't been back. I called Mike a few times afterward to ask about the place, but his number was out of service. I don't know what he knew or didn't know. Maybe he left the key with me for a reason. I never told anyone in my family what happened. I just said I cut the trip short because of bad weather. But I've looked into things since then. Read up on a lot of strange stories, especially in that part of Utah. And I keep coming across one word: skinwalker. I don't buy into legends or monsters, but I've read enough to know that the things people say they've seen. Figures that mimic human shapes, move strangely, stay silent, leave signs, that's what I saw. I don't care what it was. I'm not going back. I won't even camp alone anymore. I keep my rifle closer than ever now. And when I dream, I hear that knock, just one knock, over and over again. Whatever was out there, it wasn't a man, and it wasn't a ghost. It was something else, something real, and I don't ever want to see it again. Back in 2016, I was 34 years old, and I'd just come out of a rough breakup. It wasn't one of those explosive endings, just a slow, heavy sort of falling apart that leaves everything numb. I worked as a landscape surveyor back then, the kind of job where you spend more time walking through muddy fields with a GPS receiver than sitting in any sort of office. I liked the quiet. I preferred it, in fact. After everything with my ex, I needed a stretch of silence. That's how I ended up in Shropshire in late October. It wasn't for work, just something I booked through an old colleague who knew someone who owned a small private cabin in the hills near Clun. It was one of those off-the-grid types. No Wi-Fi, no phone signal, no neighbors for half a mile. Just trees, low clouds, and the chill of early winter creeping into your bones. The guy who owned it, a friend of a friend, like I said, kept it more like a shed than a holiday spot. It had electricity from a solar panel setup, a wood burner, and a water tank that caught rain and filtered it through a pipe system. It was bare but usable. There were 2 narrow rooms, a main one with a bed, small table, and stove, and a back room with a compost toilet and a basin. Everything smelled faintly of damp wood and old soil. It was exactly what I wanted. I arrived on a Wednesday morning. The roads narrowed the closer I got, until I was basically driving on a dirt track. I parked the car in a clearing about 200 yards from the cabin and had to carry everything in: backpack, food, firewood, and a cheap foldable chair. The silence hit me harder than I expected. No traffic, no neighbors' dogs barking, just birds and the wind pushing through the trees. First, it felt clean, like I was clearing my head out. I spent the first day just getting settled. I walked the area a bit, checked how far the tree stretched, tested the water pump, and started a small fire in the burner. There was a stack of logs just inside the door, dry and cut, which helped. I hadn't brought any books, so I passed time watching the daylight fade and listening to the forest. When the sun went down, I noticed how dark it really got. Without any streetlights or nearby homes, it was total black. My phone had a flashlight, but I turned it off and let my eyes adjust. I slept hard that first night, wrapped in layers, with my coat zipped up tight and my wool hat pulled low. The cabin creaked with the cold, and the roof tapped with water from melting frost. But it felt safe, still, even peaceful. That changed on the second day. Started small. I'd gone for a walk that afternoon. Nothing long, just stretching my legs. I followed a path that circled down through some old ash and pine trees. There were signs of wildlife, deer prints, old badger holes, but nothing out of place. I remember spotting a boot print in a muddy patch, and I assumed it was mine from the previous day. But something about the depth and angle seemed wrong. Mine had pressed straight in. This one looked more like it dragged at the toe, like someone stumbling forward. It wasn't fresh, just odd. I didn't think too hard about it at the time. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed something else. The small tin cup I'd left on the windowsill was on the floor. It hadn't broken or spilled, just tipped onto its side. I figured I'd knocked it without noticing or that it slipped somehow. I set it back and lit the burner again. The night came quicker and colder. That evening, while I sat in the foldable chair by the window, I had the sense that something outside had changed. I couldn't see anything specific. The trees looked the same. The ground was quiet, but it was like the edges of the clearing had grown heavier, as if the line between the woods and the open space had thickened. It's hard to explain, and I know how it sounds. I'm not superstitious. I don't believe in ghosts or any of that, but something in me tightened, like my body knew something my brain hadn't caught up with. I slept less that night, woke a few times, sure I'd heard something brushing against the side of the cabin. Each time I got up and checked, there was nothing, just wind and the scrape of branches. Still, I kept the flashlight beside me. On the third morning, I noticed something strange near the woodpile. A piece of cloth was stuck to the corner of the log stack. Grayish, thin, like old dress fabric. Not mine. I hadn't seen it there before. I peeled it off and looked around, but the ground didn't show anything. No footprints, no sign of anyone walking through. I left it on the table and went about the day, but something had shifted. The piece was gone. That afternoon I decided to do a wider walk, make a loop toward the old fire road the owner had mentioned. It was about a mile west, barely marked, just a strip of overgrown gravel between trees. I took my walking stick and headed out around noon. Halfway there, I passed a thick cluster of trees with twisted limbs, and something stopped me. I saw something pale between the trunks, low, still, and narrow. At first, I thought it was a deer lying down, maybe sick or dying. But when I stepped closer, I realized it wasn't an animal. It was a person, a woman. She was crouched low with her arms around her knees, facing away from me. She didn't move. I froze. My breath caught. The woods were silent. She didn't turn. She didn't flinch. Just sat there, not quite hidden, not quite exposed. Her clothes looked thin, dirty, gray layers like someone who'd been out in the weather too long. Her hair was dark and pulled back in a tight, uneven braid. Something about her posture made my skin tighten. She wasn't cold. She wasn't panicked. She was waiting. I backed away slowly. My feet barely made a sound. She didn't turn. I walked backwards for 10, maybe 15 paces, then turned and kept going until I got back to the cabin. I didn't go back out again that day. Inside, I shut the door and bolted it. Even though I hadn't touched that lock since arriving, I kept the fire going and stayed near the table. I couldn't stop thinking about her, what she was doing out there, why she looked like that, what she wanted. If she was lost, she didn't act like it. If she needed help, she could have called out. But she didn't. She didn't do anything. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing twigs snapping. I'd sit up, flashlight ready, but never saw anything outside the window, just dark and fog between the trees. On the fourth morning, the cloth on the table was gone. I thought maybe I'd thrown it out and forgotten. But then I saw a mark on the window, a smudge, a thin oval of grease or dirt, like someone had pressed their face to the glass. The size matched hers, high up, almost level with mine.
No handprints.
No footprints outside, just that smudge. That was when I knew I had to leave. I packed quickly, tossed everything into the backpack, stuffed the food into a bag, and grabbed the firewood axe from beside the burner. I wasn't thinking clearly. I just knew I didn't want to be there for another night. I stepped outside and scanned the trees. Nothing moved. It was still too still. I started walking to the clearing where the car was parked. The axe stayed in my right hand the whole time. I made it to the car, threw my gear in the back, and turned the ignition. It didn't start. Tried again. Nothing. Just a dry click. My heart thumped hard in my chest. The car had been fine. I'd driven it up without any issues. I popped the bonnet, checked the battery cables. They looked okay, but I wasn't a mechanic. Could have been anything. I looked back toward the trees. That's when I saw her again. She was standing halfway between me and the cabin. Not walking, not crouching, just standing there. Pale face, expressionless, eyes locked straight ahead. Her braid was messier now, hanging loose. Her hands were at her sides. She didn't move. I didn't shout. I didn't approach. I got back in the car, locked the doors, and sat there, watching her. She stood there for maybe 10 minutes. Then she turned slowly and walked into the trees. That's when I heard the phone vibrate in my coat. I hadn't expected a signal, but somehow one bar had come through. I opened it, and to my shock, a message had arrived from the cabin owner. Just one line. Don't talk to her. That was all. The signal vanished again. I tried to reply, but it failed. I tried calling. Nothing. It was like it had just opened for a second. Enough for that one warning to get through. I stayed in the car for over an hour. When I finally stepped out, she was gone. I grabbed my things and started walking. The nearest village was about 5 miles downhill. I knew it would take a couple hours, maybe longer with the wait. I didn't care. I didn't look back. I got to the village just after sunset. Found a pub, explained I'd broken down, and asked for help. I didn't mention the woman. I didn't know how to explain it. The next day, I paid a local to tow my car. The engine started without trouble once it was off the hill. The garage said nothing was wrong. I never went back to that cabin. I never asked the owner what he meant. I didn't want to know. I deleted his number and left it behind. But sometimes, when I walk in quiet places or see a line of trees on a cold afternoon, I remember her, that crouched shape in the woods, the stillness, the way she waited without needing anything, without fear, without warmth. I don't think she was crazy. I don't think she was lost. I think she was exactly where she wanted to be. And I think if I had stayed one more night, I'd still be there too. It was the summer of 2006 when I went to stay at my uncle's farm in rural Missouri. I was 24 then. Fresh out of a factory job, I quit because I thought I wanted something quieter. I didn't know what I wanted exactly. I just knew that the concrete, the smoke, the machines, and the shouting weren't it anymore. I needed silence. My uncle, Rich, lived on a good patch of land just outside a town called Buckhorn. It was mostly hills and cattle and cracked two-lane roads that twisted through soy fields. He owned a small cabin on the far edge of his property that hadn't been used for a long while. When I told him I was thinking about taking a break from everything, he offered it without hesitation. The cabin was maybe a quarter-mile from the main house, tucked behind a wall of trees that looked like they'd been there since the Civil War. You could barely see the place unless you were standing right in front of it. I liked that. It was built low, like it was trying to stay hidden. The roof sagged a bit, the porch was half-rotted, and every window had dirt baked into it from decades of wind and dry seasons. But it was solid. No holes in the roof, no raccoons in the attic, and the door locked fine. That was enough for me. I moved in with a backpack, a cooler, a flashlight, a pair of boots, and a few books I never got around to reading. Rich gave me access to the barn and the tool shed in case I needed anything, and he brought out groceries every few days. I thought I'd spend my time fishing, helping him with chores, and sitting out under the trees with my thoughts. For the first week, that's exactly what I did. But then I started noticing things. It was small stuff at first. One morning, I woke up and the cabin door was wide open. I was sure I'd locked it before bed. I told myself maybe I forgot. It happens. Then a few days later, I found my boots, muddy and wet, sitting next to the front steps. I hadn't worn them since the rain, and I never left them outside. I figured Rich maybe came by and borrowed them, but when I asked, he said he hadn't even been to the cabin that week. That's when I started paying more attention. The cabin didn't have electricity. I had a few lanterns and a wind-up flashlight, and at night it got real dark. No street lights, just blackness pressing against the windows like fog. The nights were loud, crickets, frogs, the occasional low moan of a cow somewhere out in the pasture. But it was peaceful in its own way. Except one night I woke up to what I thought was a person breathing. It was close, right outside the cabin wall, by where the old woodpile sat. It wasn't an animal sound. It was a slow human rhythm, inhale, exhale, steady and deep. I laid there for maybe 5 minutes, holding my breath, listening. I didn't move. I didn't check. Eventually, it stopped. When I went out the next morning, I didn't see anything unusual except for a single handprint on the window, not smeared. Just there, clear as anything. 5 long fingers. No smudge, no dirt trail, just the outline pressed in like it had been burned into the glass. I wiped it off with my sleeve and tried not to think about it. I started sleeping with a hammer next to the bed. After that, things got stranger. I'd find food from my cooler missing. Whole packages of jerky or a can of beans gone. I kept thinking maybe animals were getting in somehow, but there were no signs of entry. The cooler was always closed. One morning, I woke up and there were small bits of hay scattered all over the floor. I hadn't brought any hay into the cabin. Not once. I went outside and found a pile of it behind the cabin, stacked neatly in a square. It was like someone had tried to build a makeshift bed. Or a nest. There weren't any footprints, but the grass was flattened around it in a wide circle. Something or someone had been spending a lot of time there. I asked Rich again if he'd been out there. He shook his head and gave me a look like I was wasting his time. Just kids messing around, he said, but there weren't any kids for miles. No neighbors that close. No signs of anyone cutting through the land. Still, I didn't press. Rich wasn't the kind of man who worried easily. I started checking the cabin more thoroughly every evening before locking up. Windows, walls, floorboards, all of it. Nothing ever looked disturbed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching. I'd be sitting on the porch and catch movement at the edge of the trees, just far enough that I couldn't be sure. Sometimes I'd hear a twig snap or the rush of something fast moving through the brush. But when I got up to look, nothing was there. It was mid-July when I found the first dead animal. It was a rabbit, clean cut down the middle, no blood, just open like a zipper, with both halves laid out next to each other on the porch steps. No teeth marks, no mess. It was surgical. I stood there for a while just looking at it, trying to figure out if it was some kind of predator or if someone had done it. I buried it near the fence line. That same night, the breathing came back. It was closer this time, right outside the wall again, but this time it didn't stop. I waited an hour before I built up the courage to shine my flashlight out the window. I didn't see anything, but the breathing cut off as soon as the light hit. It didn't trail off. It just stopped, like flipping a switch. I didn't sleep after that. By August, I was considering leaving. Rich wasn't convinced anything was wrong, and I didn't have any proof, just weird stories. I felt embarrassed, even ashamed, but I knew something was going on out there. Then one night I caught it. I was sitting by the window just after midnight, light off, waiting. I had my flashlight in one hand, the hammer in the other. I don't know what I thought I'd do, but I was tired of feeling helpless. That's when I saw the movement. A shape slipping between the trees, low to the ground, fast but controlled. It crept closer, pausing behind stumps and rocks, like it knew the land better than I did. When it finally got close enough for the moonlight to catch it, my stomach turned. It was a man, not a wild animal, not a stranger just passing through. He was wearing what looked like old farm clothes, torn jeans, a jacket too heavy for the season. He had no shoes. His hair was long, matted, hanging over his face. He didn't walk upright. He moved like a wolf, crawling, pausing, listening. He reached the wall of the cabin and pressed his head against it, right where I'd heard the breathing before. I couldn't see his face. I didn't want to. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. I watched him for what felt like an hour, just listening through the wall like he was waiting to hear me shift in bed. Then he crawled away, slow, careful, back into the trees. I packed up the next morning. I didn't tell Rich why. I just said I needed to go back to town. He shrugged, said I could always come back if I changed my mind. I didn't argue. I never went back to that cabin. About a year later, Rich sold the farm, said it was getting to be too much work. He moved into a trailer closer to Springfield. The new owners cleared a lot of the land, put up new fencing, redid the barn. I drove by once out of curiosity. The cabin was still there, but they'd gutted it, replaced the porch, sealed the windows. I never got out of the car. The breathing haunted me for years. So did the man's silence, the way he moved, the fact that he didn't try to break in. It was like the cabin wasn't the point. Watching was the point. Listening, waiting. I don't know how long he'd been out there. Maybe longer than I'd ever guessed. I looked into missing persons cases from that area once, years later. There were a few. Nothing that lined up exactly. A drifter, maybe, or someone who'd been living in the woods for years. Forgotten. I still think about him. The quiet way he studied the walls. The neat pile of hay. The rabbit. I learned something about the woods that summer. Not everything that watches you wants to hurt you, but that doesn't mean it should be left alone. Some things aren't violent. They're patient, and that's worse. I never told anyone the full story. Until now. I don't go into woods anymore, and I don't sleep in places with thin walls. I was 32 the summer I found the cabin. I'd been living out of my truck for a few weeks by then, driving through parts of Montana I hadn't been to since I was a teenager. I'd taken time off work after getting laid off from a warehouse job in Spokane. It wasn't a big shock. The place had been cutting people slowly for months. I just hadn't thought it would be me. But when it happened, I didn't bother looking for another job right away. I packed what I needed in the back of my truck and started driving east, into the hills, figuring a little time away would help me clear my head. I wasn't trying to find anything in particular. Mostly, I camped near creeks or at the edges of small towns. Sometimes I stayed in a motel if the weather was rough or I needed a real shower. But most nights, I found some patch of woods and pulled off the road. I'd cook something simple on my camp stove, listen to the wind through the trees, and fall asleep in the truck bed. It was sometime in mid-July when I first saw the trailhead. I don't remember the name of the road now, just a narrow, winding thing that cut through pine forest about 30 miles southeast of Missoula. There was a rusted sign half covered in moss that read something like Hollow Ridge Trail or Hollow Tree Trail. I don't remember exactly, but it had the word hollow in it. There was a wide patch of gravel at the base of the sign, just enough space for a vehicle or two to park. I pulled over and decided to walk in a bit, just to stretch my legs. The trail started off wide, the kind of path that maybe once had regular foot traffic. Old wood beams lined parts of it to keep the slope from washing out, though most had rotted and collapsed. About a half-mile in, the trail split into two, and I took the one that led uphill. I followed it another mile or so, not really keeping track, until I saw the roof. It was hard to spot at first. The trees had grown thick around it, and the roof was covered in needles and leaves. The cabin sat back about 40 yards off the trail, tucked between a rise of boulders and a tangle of saplings. The front porch was sagging, the railing cracked and splintered. Most of the windows had long since shattered, leaving only warped frames and sharp corners. But something about it made me stop. I stood there a long time just looking at it. The wood was gray and weathered, but the walls were still standing. The roof, though bowed, hadn't caved in. A chimney rose from one side, bricks chipped and blackened at the top. It looked abandoned, clearly, but not destroyed, like it had been waiting there for a long time. I walked up the steps slowly. One of the boards cracked under my weight. The front door was hanging open about an inch. I pushed it gently, and it swung inward with a low creak. Inside, it smelled like rot and dust. A stone hearth dominated the back wall, with an iron stove built into it. The floor was littered with pine needles, mouse droppings, and scraps of old newspaper. A table sat near the center, one leg broken so it leaned to the side. There were shelves on the walls, mostly empty, though I saw a few rusted cans and jars thick with cobwebs. I stepped further in, testing the floorboards. They held, though they groaned under my boots. In the back was a small room, probably where a bed once was. Now it held only a collapsed frame and a pile of leaves. The roof above it had a dark stain where water had seeped in. I saw no signs of recent activity, no footprints, no food wrappers, nothing newer than maybe the 1980s. I don't know why I decided to stay the night. I went back to my truck, drove it up closer to the trailhead, and carried a few things in: a sleeping bag, a tarp, my stove, and a can of beans. I set up in the main room, far from the back corner where the water damage was. I laid the tarp down first to keep the dirt and bugs off me, rolled out my bag, and set my pack near the door. That night was quiet. I could hear the wind moving through the trees outside, but the cabin blocked it well. The creaks and groans of the old wood were constant, but not threatening, more like a house settling. I used my headlamp to read for a bit, then turned it off and lay there staring at the ceiling. In the morning, I made coffee on the porch and watched a pair of squirrels chase each other through the trees. I hadn't felt that calm in weeks, maybe months. I ended up staying 3 nights. Each day I cleaned a little. I swept out the worst of the debris with a pine branch. I patched a gap in the roof using some thick plastic from my truck. I moved a few of the heavier pieces of wood inside to build a better sleeping spot. Felt good, purposeful. It was on the 4th morning that I found the trapdoor. It was under the table. When I lifted it to try and level the broken leg, I noticed a square cut into the floorboards. The seams were barely visible, but once I saw them, I couldn't unsee them. I moved the table aside and pried at the edge with my pocket knife. The panel lifted slowly, stiff with age. Beneath it, a narrow set of stairs led into darkness. I didn't go down right away. I sat there for a long time, staring at the hole. There was a smell coming from it, not strong but earthy and damp, like cold soil. Later that day, I came back with my headlamp and a spare flashlight. The stairs were steep and narrow, made of unfinished wood. I moved slowly, one step at a time. The air grew colder as I descended. The beam of my light showed a low ceiling, maybe 7 feet high, and a dirt floor. It wasn't a basement, more like a root cellar. The space was maybe 10 by 15 feet. The walls were rough stone, stacked without mortar. Wooden shelves lined two sides, though they were mostly bare. I saw a few broken jars, an old lantern, and what looked like a rusted hunting trap. In the corner was a pile of old sacks, rotten and moldy. I started to turn back when I noticed something odd about the floor. It was disturbed. The rest of the cellar was hard-packed earth, covered in a thin layer of dust. But in the far corner, near the sacks, the ground looked softer. The dirt there was darker and uneven, as if it had been dug up and hastily replaced. I squatted down and touched it. The soil gave way more easily than it should have. I brushed more aside using a stick from upstairs. About 6 inches down, I hit something. Wood. It was a box. Small, maybe 2 feet long and a foot wide. I scraped more dirt off and pulled it free. The lid wasn't locked, just sealed with old nails. I pried it open with the back of my hatchet. Inside were bones, small ones. Animal bones, I thought at first, but the more I looked, the less sure I became. There was a skull. Not human, not exactly, but close. Maybe a monkey's? The rest of the bones were a tangle of ribs, vertebrae, and long, thin limbs, all wrapped in old, stained cloth. There was also a knife, rusted, with a wooden handle carved with strange symbols. I don't know how long I sat there staring. I put the lid back on and buried the box again. I packed up my things that night, hiked them all back to the truck, and left before the sun came up. I didn't sleep. I didn't go to the police. I didn't tell anyone. I wasn't sure what I'd found. Maybe it was just an animal, something that had died and been buried long ago. Maybe the knife was just some weird hunting relic. But something about that place stuck with me. Weeks went by. I got a new job in Boise, loading trucks. It was fine. The kind of work where you didn't have to think much. But at night, I kept seeing that trapdoor, that box, the bones, the knife. Eventually, I went back. About 4 months later, I told myself I needed closure, that I had to know if it was really what I thought it was. But when I got to the trailhead, the sign was gone. The gravel patch was overgrown. I spent half a day walking the trail, but I never found the split. Never saw the roof through the trees. I never found the cabin again. To this day, I still wonder if I imagined it. If it was just something my brain made up when I was feeling lost and drifting. But I know what I saw. I remember the smell of that cellar, the feel of the dirt, the weight of the box, and I still dream about that knife. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, I wake up thinking I hear something creaking under the floorboards. But I live in a second-story apartment now. There is no cellar. I never thought a hunting trip would turn into something I'd never forget. Something I'd look back on years later and still feel that knot in my stomach. The kind of trip you think will be simple, just you, the woods, and a few quiet days away from everything, but then it's not. It's something different, worse, more real. It was the fall of 2008. I was 28 years old and had recently taken up hunting. I grew up near a small town in northern Minnesota, where the forests stretch endlessly and the lakes glisten cold under the sun. The air gets sharp in October, the trees turn fiery red and gold, and everything slows down before the deep winter freeze. I decided to go out for a long weekend, alone, to a hunting cabin my uncle had left me in his will a couple of years earlier. It was a modest place, just an old log cabin in a remote part of the forest, about 20 miles from the nearest road, with no electricity and only a small wood stove for heat. The cabin had been sitting empty for a while. I'd visited once before with my uncle, but that was years ago. This time, I planned to hunt deer, spend nights by the fire, and just get away from the noise of everyday life. I needed that peace. I packed my gear carefully. A small rifle, ammo, a hunting knife, plenty of canned food, a good supply of water, matches, a lantern, and some warm clothes. My phone had no signal out there, but I told my sister where I'd be and when I'd check back in. I drove my old pickup truck as far as I could on the dirt road, then strapped on my backpack and started the hike through the forest. The trees were tall, mostly pines and birches, with thick underbrush that made walking slow. The smell of wet earth and pine needles filled the air, and every so often, I heard the call of a distant bird or the crack of a twig underfoot. The sun was low, casting long shadows through the branches as I reached the clearing where the cabin sat. The cabin looked just as I remembered. The logs were darkened with age, the roof slanted but still solid. There was a small porch and the windows had thick shutters. I unlocked the door with the key my uncle gave me and stepped inside. The air was cold but dry, smelling faintly of wood smoke and something old. Dust, maybe. The cabin was small, just one room with a tiny kitchen area, a rough wooden table, a couple of chairs, and a bed in the corner. The stove was there, too, with some firewood stacked neatly beside it. I unpacked my gear, lit a fire in the stove, and sat down to rest. Outside, the forest was silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves. I ate a simple dinner of canned beans and dried meat, then laid out my sleeping bag near the stove. The night came fast, and the temperature dropped quickly. I slept lightly that first night. Every snap of a twig outside made me open my eyes. The forest around the cabin felt different at night, older somehow. I kept thinking I heard footsteps in the distance, but each time I checked, there was nothing there, just the trees, dark and still. The next morning, I woke before dawn, brewed some coffee on the stove, and prepared my rifle. I planned to spend the day hunting near the cabin, so I packed some supplies in my bag and stepped outside. The forest was quiet except for the sound of a light breeze moving through the leaves. I moved slowly, careful not to make noise, eyes scanning the underbrush for signs of deer. The morning passed uneventfully. I spotted a few deer tracks and fresh droppings, but no animals. The forest was dense, and I had to watch every step. By midday, I was back at the cabin to rest and eat. I sat on the porch, looking out at the woods, feeling the calm of the place settle in. That evening, as I prepared to sleep, I heard something unusual. A distant howl, low and mournful, echoed through the trees. It wasn't a wolf, I'm sure of that. Wolves were rare in that part of Minnesota. It sounded more like a person or something trying to sound like a person. I didn't pay much attention, just figured it was an animal making strange noises. The third day is when things started to change. I went out early again, moving deeper into the forest. The sun was brighter, and the air felt crisper. I followed a trail I'd seen on the map near a small creek. The forest here was thick, and the underbrush tangled my legs as I moved. Then I heard it, a snapping branch nearby, much closer this time. I froze, rifle ready, eyes searching the trees. Nothing moved. The silence stretched for a long moment. Then I heard it again. A soft, almost shuffling sound, like footsteps moving slowly through dry leaves. But when I turned, no one was there. I told myself it was just an animal. maybe a deer or a raccoon. Still, I felt a chill run down my spine. I decided to head back to the cabin, quickening my pace. When I arrived, the cabin door was open. I'm certain I had locked it before I left that morning. The lock was old and tricky, but I had double-checked it. Now, the door hung slightly ajar, the cold air rushing in. My heart raced. I stepped inside, scanning the small room. Nothing seemed disturbed. My supplies were where I left them. No signs of anyone inside. I locked the door again and checked the windows. All were closed and secure. Still, I felt uneasy. I sat by the stove, trying to calm myself. Maybe I had forgotten to lock the door properly, or maybe an animal had pushed it open. That night, I stayed awake longer than usual, listening to every sound outside. The forest was alive with rustling leaves and distant calls, but nothing approached the cabin. Eventually, I drifted off to sleep, exhaustion taking over. The fourth day was colder. I woke to frost on the window panes. Outside, the forest looked different in the early light, pale and still. I decided to spend the day inside, resting and keeping the fire going. Around noon, I went outside to gather some firewood. As I moved through the clearing, I noticed fresh footprints near the cabin, boot prints much larger than mine. They were recent, pressed into the soft earth, leading away into the woods. I followed them cautiously, heart pounding. The prints headed into the thick trees, twisting and turning. I kept going until I saw something that made my stomach drop. A pile of branches and leaves arranged strangely near a tree stump, as if someone had tried to make a small shelter or a hiding spot. Nearby, I saw scraps of fabric, maybe from a jacket or a shirt, caught on the bushes. That was no animal. I returned to the cabin quickly and locked the door. I searched the cabin again, looking for any signs of someone hiding. I found nothing. I felt watched. The idea that someone had been close to me without my knowledge was terrifying. I realized I wasn't as alone as I thought. That night, I couldn't sleep at all. I sat by the fire, rifle in hand, eyes fixed on the dark window. Every sound outside made me jump. Around midnight, I heard the door creak. I didn't move at first, afraid that any sudden action would alert whoever was outside. The creak came again. A slow, deliberate sound. Someone was trying to open the door. I raised the rifle and pointed it at the door, ready to fire. The door handle rattled, then suddenly stopped. Silence. I waited for what felt like hours, breathing slow, trying to calm down. Nothing happened after that. The sun started to rise, and I finally lowered the rifle. I knew I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed my things quickly and got ready to leave. I planned to hike back to the truck and drive away. As I stepped outside, I scanned the clearing. There was a figure in the distance, just standing between the trees, watching me. I couldn't see his face, just the shape, tall, broad-shouldered, wearing dark clothes. I didn't wait to see more. I turned and ran through the woods, heart pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. I didn't stop until I reached the truck, gasping for breath and shaking. I locked myself inside, started the engine, and sped down the dirt road. The forest closed behind me, dark and quiet once more. On the way back to town, I called my sister from a gas station. She was shocked when I told her what happened. The police were reluctant to believe me at first, but I showed them the footprints, the makeshift shelter, the open door. They promised to send patrols to the area. I never went back to that cabin after that trip. The memory stayed with me, though. The feeling of being watched in the woods, the sound of the door creaking in the night, and that distant figure standing silent among the trees. Years later, I still can't explain what happened out there. No one was caught or identified. Maybe it was a hunter like me, or maybe something worse, a criminal hiding in the woods. Whatever it was, it reminded me how fragile safety is when you step into the wild, how quickly peace can turn into fear. And it taught me to trust my instincts, because sometimes the scariest thing in the forest isn't a ghost or a monster. It's a real person, watching you from the shadows, waiting for the right moment. I was 36 when it happened. It was the summer of 2016 in the northern part of Minnesota, just outside a small town called Redwater, which I hadn't heard of until I ended up there. I was on a solo trip across the Midwest, taking a few weeks off work to decompress. I'd been working in logistics for nearly a decade, managing supply lines for a major distribution company in Ohio. The burnout had crept in slowly over the years until I couldn't ignore it anymore. I told my manager I needed time away. No laptop, no emails, no spreadsheets. Just quiet. I drove an old silver Tacoma I'd bought from a friend a few years back. It was reliable, simple, and had a built-in camper shell I could sleep in if I didn't want to set up a tent. I packed light, some dry food, a small gas stove, a cooler, and my sleeping bag. I had a few paper maps, an old Garmin GPS, and no real plan beyond driving north and sticking to the less traveled roads. It was day 6 of my trip when I blew a rear tire about 30 miles outside Redwater. I didn't panic. I knew how to change a tire, but when I got the jack under the truck and hoisted it up, I realized the spare I had was flat, too. My stupid mistake. I'd meant to get it checked before the trip, but kept putting it off. There was no signal where I broke down. I tried walking around a bit to catch a bar. Holding my phone above my head like that would magically make something happen. Didn't. I had no choice but to start walking. I grabbed a bottle of water and locked the truck. The road I'd taken was a rough gravel trail off the main route. I thought it was a shortcut. It wasn't. The heat wasn't bad, and the woods on both sides offered shade. But I kept feeling like I was being watched. Maybe that sounds cliche, but I'm not the jumpy type. I'd grown up hunting with my dad in southern Pennsylvania. I'd spent nights alone in the woods before, but something about that walk made me keep glancing behind me. Not because I heard anything, but because it felt like I should. About 45 minutes in, a rusted white van passed me going the opposite way. It slowed down briefly, then kept going without stopping. Just as it disappeared over the small hill behind me, I heard a voice yell, something faint. I turned, but the van was gone. I kept walking, and eventually, after what felt like forever, I spotted a cabin tucked back from the road, partially hidden by tall pine trees. It wasn't a normal house. It looked more like a working cabin, small, with faded green siding and a metal roof that had rust lines along the edges. A faded wooden sign nailed to a post read Knowles Auto and Small Engine Repair. I figured the owner might have a phone or, better yet, a working tire pump. I walked up the path and knocked. No answer. I tried again. Still nothing. The porch was scattered with broken tools, oil cans, and what looked like an old snowmobile track. The door wasn't locked, so I stepped inside. The smell hit me first, grease, old wood, and something sour like rotting fruit or stale meat. The place was cluttered with parts, empty food wrappers, and torn magazines. A small radio on a shelf was playing static, just the white noise hum of nothing. I called out but got no reply. I didn't want to snoop, but I also didn't want to wait on the road for hours with no idea if help was coming. I stepped around some stacked tires and headed for what looked like a small office. There was a rotary phone on the wall, but when I picked it up, there was no dial tone, just silence. I was about to leave when I heard footsteps on the porch. I backed away from the door and moved behind the cluttered counter. The footsteps stopped, and the door creaked open. A man stepped inside. He was tall, maybe late 50s, with wild gray hair that stuck out under a grimy baseball cap. His eyes were dark and hard to read. His clothes were smeared with oil and dirt. He looked at me like he wasn't surprised I was there, like he'd known I was coming. I raised my hands slightly to show I meant no harm. I explained the flat tire, the lack of signal, and asked if he had a pump or a spare I could use. He didn't say anything for a while, just stood there in the doorway with his eyes on me. Then he nodded once and walked past me to the back room without a word. He came out with a hand pump and an old tire. He motioned for me to follow him. I did. We walked around the side of the cabin where an old ATV sat rotting in the grass. He gestured to a flat stone and told me to sit. Then he got to work. He didn't talk. He just worked. He inflated the spare and checked its pressure, then pointed down the road and held up 3 fingers. I guessed that meant I should go 3 miles. I thanked him. He didn't respond. I offered to pay, but he just stared at me and walked back toward the cabin. Something about him put me on edge. It wasn't just that he was quiet. It was how he moved, slow, deliberate, always watching me from the corner of his eye. I waited until he was inside before I started walking back. That should have been the end of it. But something about him and that place stuck with me. About halfway back to my truck, I realized I'd left my water bottle behind on the porch. I almost kept walking, but it was hot, and I didn't know how long I'd be out there before I made it back to the truck and changed the tire. So, like an idiot, I turned around. When I got back, the cabin looked different. Still quiet, still the same junk on the porch. But the front door was open this time, not just unlocked. Open. I walked up slowly and grabbed my bottle. Then I heard something from inside, a dragging sound, like someone moving furniture or something heavy across the floor. I told myself to leave, but my curiosity won. I stepped inside again and followed the noise. The back room, where he'd disappeared earlier, was darker than I remembered. The blinds were pulled down now, and there was a faint smell, something metallic. I peeked through the cracked door. What I saw made me freeze. The man was standing over a tarp. On it were pieces of clothing, shoes, and a backpack that didn't look like it belonged to him. Everything was stained. The walls around him had deep scratches, and in the corner was a pile of what looked like burned ID cards and driver's licenses. He hadn't seen me yet. I backed up slowly, careful not to make a sound. I stepped on something soft and looked down. It was a glove. Not his size. Definitely not his style. I didn't wait any longer. I bolted out the door and ran back down the road. When I got to my truck, I threw the spare on without bothering to fully tighten the bolts. I just needed to get out of there. I drove for miles before stopping. I don't even remember the drive, just the blur of trees and dust. I didn't call the cops right away. Part of me didn't want to get involved. I didn't know what I saw, not for sure. But over the next day, I couldn't shake the image of that tarp or the pile of IDs. Eventually, I drove to the Redwater Sheriff's office and told them everything. I gave them the location as best I could. They listened but didn't say much. The deputy took notes, nodded, and said they'd check it out. I never heard back from them. A few weeks later, I looked online for any news about the area. Nothing. No arrests. No missing person found. The shop wasn't even listed anywhere. It was like it didn't exist. I still don't know what I walked in on. Maybe the guy was just a hoarder, collecting junk from people who left stuff behind. Maybe those IDs weren't real. But deep down, I think I know the truth. I stayed on the road for the rest of my trip, never straying too far from a major route. When I got home, I sold the truck and didn't go camping for a long time. Sometimes I wake up from dreams of that cabin. I see his eyes watching me. I hear the dragging sound and the creak of the door. I wonder how many others walked that same road and never made it out. And I wonder if anyone ever found that cabin at all. It was late September of 2022 when I made the drive up through northern Idaho. I was heading to Sandpoint from my new place outside of Missoula, Montana. The quickest route had always been straight up through the forested 2-lane highways. Miles of nothing but trees, dirt roads, abandoned trailers, and the occasional hand-painted sign for elk jerky or used tires. I always preferred it that way, even after everything that happened years before. I had avoided that road since the divorce. I never had a reason to be near it anymore. It passed right by the turnoff that led to his old cabin. Our cabin, technically, but I hadn't set foot near it in over 5 years. When we split, I let him have it. It was deep in the woods, isolated, up some barely passable dirt track that didn't even have a name on Google Maps. A place you only find if you know where it is. He loved it for that reason. I hated it for that reason. But that day, I didn't plan on stopping. I just wanted to get to Sandpoint, see my sister, and get back in one piece. I didn't think about the cabin at all until I passed the turnoff. That sharp bend in the road after the mile marker with the 2 bullet holes. Still there even after all this time. Something about the way the sunlight cut through the trees that afternoon pulled my attention sideways. My foot came off the gas. I let the car roll. The dirt path was still visible through the underbrush. Someone had driven down it not long ago. I could see fresh tire tracks in the gravel. Wide ones, not like the skinny tires his old truck used to leave. I should have kept driving. I didn't know that place a thing, but I was curious. I hadn't heard from him in over 2 years.
No emails.
No birthday messages. Nothing. And part of me, a stupid part, wondered if he was even still alive. I don't know what made me turn off the road. I told myself I'd just drive halfway down, see if the cabin was still standing, then come back. Maybe I needed closure. Or maybe I just wanted to know that whatever had lived in that place had finally died. So I turned the wheel. The dirt road was rougher than I remembered. Tree branches scratched the sides of my car, and I had to slow to a crawl to keep from scraping the undercarriage. The air grew still, thicker almost. It had rained recently. I could smell wet earth and pine sap, and the tires crunched over soft mud and loose stone. The sun was lower now, filtered through heavy branches, flickering across my windshield like a strobe light. Everything looked the same and different all at once, familiar and strange. After about 10 minutes of crawling, the trees thinned slightly, and I saw it through the branches, the cabin, still standing, still dark, still the same ugly brown siding we had never gotten around to replacing. One of the shutters was hanging loose, swinging in the breeze. The roof looked warped, moldy even, but there was something else. A newer car was parked in front. Not his, a black SUV, clean.
No rust.
Shiny enough to reflect the trees. The license plate wasn't one I recognized. I let my car idle and stared at it. The windows were tinted dark, and there were no bumper stickers or dents. Just a smooth, polished vehicle that looked completely out of place in front of that rotting shack. I parked a little ways back, cutting the engine and letting the quiet settle in. My ears adjusted to the stillness.
No birds.
No wind, just the ticking of my engine as it cooled. I sat there for a long time watching that SUV. Eventually, I got out. The air was cooler than I expected. A chill crept under my jacket, and the smell of mildew was stronger here. The ground was soft, uneven. I stepped around muddy ruts and fallen pine branches. My boots sank a little with each step. I moved slowly, half expecting someone to come out and ask what the hell I was doing there. But no one did. The front door was shut, curtains drawn. The windows looked fogged from the inside. I stayed far back. I didn't want to knock. I didn't want to go in. I just wanted to see. That's what I kept telling myself. But then I noticed something that made me take a step closer. A stain. Something dark trailing down from the wooden steps, soaked into the grain. It wasn't fresh, it had dried, but it was still there, like oil, or something thicker. My stomach turned. I looked at the SUV again. There was dirt on the tires, but not much. Someone had only just arrived. I heard a creak from the back of the house. A branch snapping, or maybe a footstep. I froze. The forest had always played tricks on the ears. Echoes bouncing off trees, birds sounding like voices. I knew all that. I'd lived it. But this sound was different. It was close, deliberate. I took a few steps back toward my car, keeping my eyes on the cabin. Something inside me had shifted. That deep animal sense that things were wrong, that I shouldn't be there. That's when I saw the tarp. It was half buried behind the cabin, just visible between two tree trunks. Plastic blue tarp weighed down with rocks, and something beneath it, long, human length. I stopped breathing. I don't know how long I stood there staring at that shape, but I knew I couldn't stay. I turned and hurried back to my car, trying not to break into a run. Every noise felt louder now. The wind through the branches, the crunch of leaves beneath my feet, my heartbeat in my ears. I got in, locked the doors, and started the engine. The sound was deafening in the quiet. I backed up, careful not to hit anything, then turned around and followed the same path out, tires spinning slightly in the wet earth. I didn't stop until I was back on the highway. Even then, I didn't pull over. I just drove, faster than I should have. Heart racing, thoughts jumbled. I didn't call the cops. Not at first. Couldn't. What would I say? That I saw a shape under a tarp in front of my ex-husband's cabin? That I heard a sound? That someone's car was there? I didn't even know whose car it was. But the image of that tarp stayed with me. For days, it followed me in my dreams. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it, and I knew I couldn't ignore it. So, a week later, I called the local sheriff's department. I didn't give my name. I just told them there was a cabin deep off a dirt road north of Wallace, Idaho, that someone might want to check it out, that there was a black SUV parked out front, and something strange out back. I hung up before they could ask questions. I don't know what happened after that. I never found any news reports. I checked every few days. Nothing. No missing persons matching the vehicle. No stories about a body in the woods. Nothing at all. I don't know if they ever found the place. It was hard to reach even when you knew where it was. Maybe they never even looked. Sometimes I wonder if the SUV is still there, covered in pine needles and sap, slowly sinking into the earth. Maybe whoever it belonged to never left. Maybe someone was watching me the whole time from the trees, waiting. I sold my car a month after that. I didn't want it anymore. I couldn't shake the idea that I'd carried something back with me. Some smell, some presence, something I couldn't name. I haven't been back to Idaho since. That cabin is still out there, I think. Still rotting under the trees. Still hiding whatever's buried behind it. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder if my ex-husband ever left. Maybe the SUV wasn't a visitor. Maybe it was him. Maybe he changed. Maybe he stayed in that place and became something else entirely. Or maybe someone else moved in after he died. Maybe that cabin just draws people in. People like me. People who should have kept driving. It was October 2014, and I had just turned 36. I was 2 years into a career shift out of marketing and into writing. It wasn't going well, not by a long shot. I'd sold one short story to a regional magazine that folded before my piece was even printed. Most of my days were spent staring at a blinking cursor in my apartment in Boulder, Colorado. I was living off some savings and freelance copywriting jobs, but barely. I thought a change of scenery might help. Get me away from the noise, from the city, from myself. I found a cabin listed on a local classified site. It wasn't on Airbnb or a rental platform, just a plain post with some grainy photos and a few sentences. A man named Gary had built it decades ago and was now too old to visit it. He said it was deep in the Route National Forest near a place called Clark. No internet, no neighbors, no phone signal, just silence. That's exactly what I thought I needed. I paid for 4 weeks up front. The price was almost suspiciously low. I got a hand-drawn map in the mail with a note telling me where to turn off the highway, where the dirt road split, and how to reach the cabin. "Don't bring too much," the note said. "You'll have to walk the last half mile." I left on a Sunday morning, just as a weak snow flurry started. My car was packed with food, water jugs, my laptop, some paper notebooks, a solar charger, batteries, and a few clothes. I had boots, a camp stove, a small axe, a hatchet, a knife, and a Beretta I'd inherited from my dad when he died. I didn't expect trouble, but the idea of being unarmed way out there didn't sit well with me. The drive took nearly 6 hours. The last hour was on barely maintained logging roads. Eventually, I parked under a large pine tree, just like the map said, and hiked in with my gear. Took me 2 trips. The first thing I noticed was how completely silent it was. No wind,
No birds.
just this thick, pressing stillness that made my ears ring. The cabin was smaller than I expected. 1 room, a cot, a wood stove, a table, a single chair, and shelves lined with canned goods and tools. There was a small side closet with a composting toilet. No sink, no electricity, no running water. But it was dry, solid, and warmer than I expected. I unpacked, lit a fire, and set up my laptop and notebooks on the table. I told myself I'd start writing first thing the next morning. That night, the cold hit hard. The fire went out around 2 a.m., and I had to get up to relight it. I could see my breath even inside the cabin. My sleeping bag didn't do much to help. I was awake for hours, staring at the rafters, listening to what I thought might be snow falling outside. But when I opened the door to check, there was nothing, just that same deep stillness. By the end of the first week, I had written less than 10 pages. I kept getting distracted. I think I heard something outside, like a soft shuffle of feet or the crunch of a boot on gravel. But every time I checked, there was nothing.
No footprints.
No animals, just the trees and the windless cold. The second week, I started to feel different. Anxious, uneasy. The woods felt closer. The trees seemed tighter, like they'd crept forward in the night. I kept the Beretta on the table within reach. It was around then that I found the notebook. It was stuffed into the back corner of one of the shelves, behind a rusted tin of baked beans. Leather-bound, pages yellowed and curled. Inside were dozens of entries, all handwritten in the same cramped style. No dates, no names, just page after page of thoughts, mostly paranoid. The writer kept referring to something out there. He said he'd seen lights in the trees, heard voices outside the walls. He'd drawn strange symbols, scratched hard into the paper. By the end of the notebook, the entries had become almost unreadable. Just long strings of the same words repeated over and over. Watching, listening, closer. I almost threw it in the fire, but I kept it. I don't know why. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I lay in the cot, the Beretta on my chest, staring at the shadows the fire cast on the wooden walls. I kept thinking I'd see someone outside the window, but the glass only reflected the firelight and my own face, drawn, pale, cracked at the eyes. The next morning, I found footprints. Not mine. They were in the frost that had settled overnight. I'd gone out to chop more wood and noticed them circling the cabin. They weren't boots, at least not like mine. They were narrow, long, and came to a point at the toes. No tread pattern, just smooth soles. They circled the cabin twice, stopped by the window, then vanished into the woods. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe I was seeing things. Maybe it was snow melt. Maybe. That day I built a perimeter. Just some old cans strung with fishing line and bells from the shelf. I set them up around the edge of the clearing, maybe 30 feet out. I figured if something or someone moved out there, I'd hear it. That night, just after midnight, the bells rang. Not all of them, just the ones on the east side. I jumped up, gun in hand, heart in my throat. I killed the fire so I wouldn't be visible through the windows. I crouched under the table and waited, listening. Nothing.
No footsteps. No breathing.
Just the faint clink of a bell swinging in the windless air. It took everything I had not to open the door and go out there. But I waited. Hours passed. My legs cramped. My lips dried out. I finally dozed off sometime near dawn. The next morning, the bells were still swinging. No wind. I walked the perimeter.
No footprints.
No broken twigs. Just one of the bells missing, gone. Clean off the line. The string cut. The third week is a blur. I stopped writing. I stopped sleeping. I spent most nights curled up in the corner, gun across my lap, eyes fixed on the door. I moved the table and cot to barricade it. I started hearing things, scratching at the walls, low knocks on the window, clicks against the roof. Always too quiet to be certain. Always gone when I looked. The final night, it all came to a head. It was a Thursday, cold enough that my breath fogged the air inside even with the fire blazing. I cooked a can of stew, ate half of it, then dumped the rest outside. I don't know why, just wanted it gone. Around midnight, the bells went off again. All of them, every single one, clanging, screaming, shuddering. It sounded like a dozen people running in circles just outside the clearing. I killed the fire again and grabbed the gun. Then I heard footsteps, heavy, fast, coming straight for the door. I fired a shot through the wood. Silence. The bells stopped.
No footsteps. No sounds.
Nothing. I waited for hours, eyes on the door. The fire burned out. The cold returned. I didn't move. At sunrise, I opened the door. No one. But there were footprints. Dozens of them. The same narrow, pointed ones I'd seen before. All around the cabin. Around the woodpile. Around the outhouse. They didn't lead in from the woods. They just appeared at the edge of the clearing. Then I saw what they'd left. Pile of rocks. Right in the middle of the clearing. A small pyramid, maybe 2 feet tall. Perfectly stacked. Balanced. At the top, the missing bell. Hanging from a stick stabbed into the top stone. I didn't clean up. Didn't pack. I left everything, laptop, notebooks, clothes, everything. I took the Beretta, my boots, and a flashlight. I ran the entire half-mile back to the car. When I got there, the tires were flat. All 4, sliced clean. I drove on the rims until I hit pavement. It took almost a full day to get back to Boulder. I didn't call the police. What would I say? There were no signs of a break-in. No damage. Just prints. Bells. Rocks. I never went back for my things. Never contacted Gary. I checked the classified site a month later. His listing was gone.
No trace.
It's been nearly 11 years. I still live in Boulder. I don't write anymore. I work construction now. Something about keeping my hands busy, working in groups, being around people, it helps. But I never go near the mountains alone. And sometimes, when the wind is still and the night is too quiet, I think about the bells. About the way they all rang at once. About the footprints that started where the forest ended. And I wonder how many others saw the same notebook. How many left something behind in those woods. And how many never made it back to tell the story. It was the fall of 2012 when I decided to take a break from everything. The city had grown loud, crowded, and tiring, and I needed some time alone to think. I packed up my old Jeep with supplies, my worn backpack, and enough food for a week. My dog, Ranger, a big, golden retriever with a calm but alert nature, was my only companion. I wanted to get away from noise and people, to somewhere quiet where the air smelled like pine and earth, somewhere simple. After driving for almost 8 hours north from the edge of Atlanta, I reached the small mountain town of Blue Ridge in Georgia. The streets there were narrow and winding, lined with wooden houses and small shops selling local crafts. I stopped briefly in town to fill my gas tank and buy some fresh supplies. People smiled politely but didn't ask many questions, which was fine by me. I liked being alone. From Blue Ridge, I followed a narrow dirt road that curved deep into the Chattahoochee National Forest. The trees grew taller and thicker as I drove. The dirt road was bumpy and full of potholes, but the Jeep handled it well. Eventually, I reached a small gravel driveway that led to the cabin I had rented. The cabin was an old, 2-story wooden structure built decades ago, tucked away among towering oaks and maples. Moss hung from the branches, and the fading orange of fall leaves lay scattered on the ground. The cabin looked worn but solid. A stone chimney rose from one side, and a wooden porch wrapped around the front. The windows were small, with cracked glass and peeling white paint on the frames. The door creaked when I pushed it open, revealing a simple interior. A small living room with a stone fireplace, a tiny kitchen with basic appliances, and 2 bedrooms upstairs. It was exactly what I wanted: simple, quiet, and far from everything. Ranger was curious immediately. He sniffed every corner of the cabin, then trotted outside to explore the yard, his tail wagging. I unloaded my bags and started a fire in the fireplace to warm the chilly air. The sun was starting to set, and the shadows grew long among the trees. I could hear the distant call of birds settling in for the night and the gentle rustling of leaves in the wind. That first night, I slept better than I had in months. The sounds of the forest were unfamiliar but soothing. Ranger stayed close, his soft breathing the only other sound besides the crackling fire. The next day, I explored the area around the cabin. A narrow trail wound through the woods, and I walked it with Ranger, enjoying the fresh air and the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. We found a small creek where Ranger drank eagerly from the cold water. The forest was beautiful and peaceful, full of birds, squirrels, and the occasional deer. The days passed quietly. I cooked simple meals on the small stove, read old paperbacks I had brought, and spent hours just sitting on the porch watching the trees. Ranger was happy and calm, but on the 3rd day something changed. It began late in the afternoon. I had gone down to the creek to fill my water bottles when I noticed that Ranger was alert, ears perked and eyes scanning the woods. He growled low and moved toward the tree line, his body tense. I called him back, but he didn't respond. His fur along his spine stood up. At first, I thought it might be a wild animal, maybe a coyote or a bobcat, but I saw no movement. The woods were silent except for the wind through the leaves. I felt uneasy but shrugged it off. Ranger returned after a moment, tail down but still uneasy. That night, I stayed close to the fire. Ranger sat beside me, watching the dark woods beyond the porch. The shadows seemed thicker, almost alive. A sound broke the silence, a faint snapping of twigs far off in the forest. Ranger's ears shot forward, and he growled again. The firelight flickered, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. I tried to ignore it. I told myself the woods were full of animals, and this was normal. But the sounds continued, distant footsteps, soft but deliberate. I felt eyes on me, though I couldn't see anyone. Ranger stayed alert, his whole body tense. The next morning, I found something strange near the edge of the property. Footprints. They were large, heavy, and unlike any animal print I recognized. Human maybe, but the toes were long, and the stride was strange, too wide, uneven. Someone had been close. My heart pounded. I scanned the woods but saw nothing. Ranger growled low again and refused to move from my side. I packed my bags slowly, ready to leave, but decided to wait until daylight. The road back was rough and I didn't want to risk driving in the dark. The rest of the day was uneasy. I checked the doors and windows repeatedly. Every sound made me jump. Ranger stayed close. His calm disappeared, replaced by an alertness I'd never seen before. I felt watched. It was as if something was just beyond the trees, watching, waiting. That night, the sounds came closer. The snapping of twigs was louder, more frequent. At one point, I saw a shadow move just beyond the tree line, tall and thin. My heart froze. Ranger barked sharply, a sound I hadn't heard from him before, urgent and fierce. The shadow vanished. I sat by the fire, gripping a heavy metal flashlight. I stayed awake all night, watching the darkness. The woods seemed to close in around me. I thought about what I'd read before about people disappearing in the mountains, about hunters and drifters. The loneliness of the forest made everything feel bigger, more dangerous. Morning came, pale and gray. I was exhausted but alive. I packed everything quickly, calling Ranger to the Jeep. As we drove down the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a brief moment, I thought I saw someone standing at the edge of the forest, watching us leave. Back in town, I reported the strange footprints and shadow to the ranger station. They said they had no reports of missing persons, but they warned me to be careful and avoid the area after dark. The woods were known for hunters and squatters, people who lived off the grid and didn't like visitors. I never went back to that cabin. I still think about those nights sometimes, about the feeling of being watched and the heavy silence of the forest. Ranger and I stayed closer after that, always alert, always aware that sometimes the wilderness hides more than just trees and animals. The experience taught me that nature is beautiful but wild and unpredictable. It's not just about peace and quiet. It holds dangers, shadows cast by more than just the fading light. The forest keeps its secrets, and some are better left alone.